He threatened the class with a knife. The Deathworld girl ended it in seconds. The cafeteria at Nexus Academy served something they called human-compatible protein substitute, and I ate it every morning because it was free, and I had 43 credits left until the next stipend cycle. It tasted like wet cardboard that had once, in a previous life, been in the same room as a chicken. I ate it anyway. I had eaten worse. Back home in the Appalachian Reclamation Zone, there was a stretch of 3 winters where worse was just called dinner. My name is Mara Voss. I was 20 years old, 5'4", and the only human enrolled in the Xenolinguistics program at Nexus Academy, which, in case you have never heard of it, is the most prestigious interstellar university in the Outer Collective. It orbits a pale blue dwarf star about 11 light-years from Earth, and it accepts students from 47 recognized species, and it had, in its 400-year history, admitted exactly 9 humans total. I was number 9. My roommate Svel was Thalori. Tall, thin, softly bioluminescent, his skin produced a faint blue-white glow that brightened when he was calm and dimmed when he was not. He had done what he called preliminary research on humans before I arrived. He told me this on the first day while standing very still near the door, the way you stand when you want the option to leave quickly. I asked him what the research said. He said, carefully, that humans were categorized in the collective's academic taxonomy as a Class 4 persistence predator, originating from an anomalous high-volatility planet designated Earth-Sol, and that the survival rate for species emerging from Class 4 or higher Deathworlds was, historically, less than 3%, and that humans were, in the current galactic census, the only Class 4 species to have achieved interstellar travel rather than extinction. I told him that was a lot of words. He dimmed slightly. I told him I was going to get coffee and asked if he wanted anything. He said he did not consume caffeine-based stimulants. I said that was a shame. He was still standing by the door when I left. The orientation week was a bureaucratic disaster of a kind that I suspect is universal across all species and all planets. There were forms. There were more forms. There was a welcome address by the university chancellor, a Silvari named Elindri, whose speaking voice produced a faint harmonic hum that the translation earpiece in my left ear rendered as warm but slightly ominous. There was a tour of the campus that took 4 hours and covered approximately 1/7 of the actual campus, which was the size of a small city. On the 3rd day, I was coming out of the equipment library on the east side of the science complex when a storage crate came off a high shelf. It was one of the big composite frame ones they used for field survey gear. 40 pounds, easy, maybe more. It was directly above the head of a Vectari student who was standing below it, looking at a display screen, completely unaware. I caught it. One hand. Mid-sentence, I had been telling Svel, who was walking beside me, that the map on my orientation packet was oriented incorrectly and had been leading me to the wrong building for 2 days. I reached up, grabbed the crate as it fell, and set it down on the floor. Then I finished my sentence about the map. Svel's skin went out. Not dim, out, completely dark like someone had cut the power. He stood very still. The Vectari student turned around, looked at the crate on the floor, looked at me, and made a sound I had never heard before. The translation earpiece processed it for a moment and then offered, involuntary distress vocalization, no direct equivalent. I looked at both of them. I said the shelf bracket is loose, someone should report that. The Vectari student left without saying anything. Svel walked next to me all the way back to the dormitory and did not speak once. His skin stayed dark until we were inside the room, and then it came back slowly, the way embers come back when you blow on them. I asked if he was all right. He said, "You caught that crate." I said yes. He said, "With one hand." I said the other hand had my coffee. He made a sound the earpiece translated as processing. I found out later that across the hall, a student named Pell, a Vectari 3rd year, who had seen the whole thing through the open doorway, had sent a message to 3 separate friends describing what he witnessed. The messages were, apparently, not calm. I did not know any of this at the time. I was thinking about whether the cafeteria had rotated to a new protein substitute yet, or whether it was still the cardboard chicken situation. At the end of orientation week, there was a commons gathering, all first-year students, all species, one large room, free beverages that were species-appropriate or at least labeled with confidence. I stood near the back with a mug of something brown and hot that the dispenser called coffee, but which I suspected had never met a coffee bean. From across the room, I noticed a Keth student watching me. The Keth were serpentine, long, layered, with iridescent scale plating along the neck and jaw. They were also, as a species, one of the founding members of the Outer Collective and deeply proud of it. This one was tall even by Keth standards. His name, I would learn later, was Draven. He watched me the way you watch something you have not yet decided how to categorize. I looked back. He did not look away. I looked away first, because my coffee was getting cold and that felt more urgent. At some point in the evening, Svel appeared at my elbow. His skin was a steady warm amber, which I had started to understand meant he was settled, comfortable. He had also, at some point during the week, stopped standing near the door. He said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Sure." He said, "Are all humans like you?" I thought about it. I thought about my mother, who had once set her own broken wrist using a fence post and a strip of leather, and gone back to work the same afternoon. I thought about my neighbor Cal, who was 63 years old and had survived 4 bog crawler encounters and a structural collapse and a wildfire, and still complained mainly about the price of fuel cells. I thought about the kids I grew up with, who had all, to varying degrees, learned to read weather and terrain and silence the way other kids learned to read books. I took a sip of the brown hot lie in my mug. "Honey," I said, "I am the boring one." Svel's skin flickered. The earpiece gave me the translation after a moment, uncertain laughter, species equivalent. I finished my coffee. Across the room, Draven was still watching. I decided to find that interesting later. The Xenolinguistics lecture hall was a long, curved room with tiered seating that descended toward a central teaching floor. The ceiling was high. The acoustics were designed for multi-species hearing ranges, and the seats were built for Vectari, which meant they were slightly too wide and slightly too flat for me. I had compensated by putting my bag on the seat beside me, sitting sideways, and propping one knee up on the edge of the desk like I was sitting on a porch. Professor Elindri, the Silvari chancellor who also taught the introductory seminar, had looked at my posture on the first day, and then looked away in what I read as a deliberate choice not to address it. There were 14 students in the room that morning, representing 9 species. Svel was 2 rows up and to my left, his skin at a calm, steady blue. He liked linguistics. It turned out, the way some people like puzzles. He was good at it. A pair of Thalori students I did not know well sat near the front. 3 Vectari, including Pell, who still looked at me like I was a math problem he couldn't solve. 2 Silvari students near the aisle. A Keth student named Vel, who was not Draven, at the far end of the middle tier. I was drawing in the margin of my notes. Not taking notes, drawing. Small, detailed sketches of bog crawlers. I had been drawing them since I was a kid. They were good reference. 6 legs, wide-set jaw, the particular hunch of the shoulders when they were thinking about charging. I had drawn approximately 400 bog crawlers in my lifetime, and I found them meditative. Elindri was midway through a lecture on tonal register shifts in Vectari formal speech, how the angle of the crest during a vowel cluster changed the social weight of the sentence, not just the meaning. It was genuinely interesting. I had stopped drawing to listen. The door opened. I did not look up immediately. People came in late. It happened. But the room changed. Not loudly. Just a shift, the way air in a forest changes when something heavy starts moving through it. I felt it before I understood it. I looked up. A Vektari student was standing at the front of the room, near the base of the lecture floor. I recognized him. I had seen him once or twice in the corridor near the registrar's office, always in a hurry, always with the particular expression of someone who has been receiving bad news for a long time. His name, I would later confirm, was Pros. 3rd year. Academic probation. His crest, which a healthy Vektari held high and proud, was flattened completely against his skull. He was holding a knife. The Vektari called it a morning blade. I had read about them in my pre-enrollment xenoculture prep material. Ceremonial, but made from real materials, a composite alloy edge, functional as any working knife. It was used in Vektari grief rites, traditionally held by a family elder. Seeing one in a student's hand in the middle of a lecture hall was not something the prep materials had covered. The room collapsed. That is the only word for it. 14 beings hit their individual distress responses at the same moment, and the room just collapsed inward on itself. Svel went dark immediately, the full power cut dark I had seen once before. The two Thalori near the front made a high, thin sound and gripped each other. One of them slid off her seat onto the floor. Pel pressed himself against the back wall with both hands flat against it. The Solvari students produced a subsonic sound that I felt in my back teeth rather than heard. Professor Alindri went completely still. 14 beings, 9 species. Every single one of them was in their fear response within 2 seconds. I stopped drawing. I looked at Pros. I looked at the knife. I exhaled once through my nose. That was the whole of my reaction. Not because I was performing calm, not because I was trying to be impressive, but because I had grown up in a place where actual danger was a daily variable, and somewhere in the part of my brain that handled threat assessment, Pros and his morning blade registered differently than they registered for everyone else in that room. His hands were shaking, not a little, significantly. The kind of shaking that comes from something long building finally breaking through. The blade was angled toward the room, but his wrist was loose, turned slightly inward. His crest was flat not from aggression, flat from shame and exhaustion. His eyes were moving over the room like he was looking for something to land on and couldn't find it. He was not there to hurt anyone. He was there because he had run out of other places to go. I had seen that before too, not in alien students, in people back home, in boys who had pushed themselves past what they could carry and then stood somewhere they didn't belong with something in their hands that they didn't quite know how to put down. I set my pen on the desk. I stood up. Nobody else was standing. I was aware of that. The math of it was simple and the room clearly felt it, one human, standing, moving toward the knife. Every other being in the room was pressed back, folded in, eyes wide. I walked toward Pros, slowly, not the way you walk toward a threat, the way you walk toward something you don't want to startle. He saw me coming. His crest flickered, a micro-expression that the earpiece flagged as confusion. I stopped about 6 feet from him. I said quietly just to him, not to the room, "Hey, you look like you're having a really bad day." The room behind me was not breathing. Pros stared at me, his jaw worked once, no sound came out. I said, "Whatever is happening, whatever brought you in here, it doesn't have to end the way you're thinking it ends. There are other ways." His wrist shifted, not aggressively. The blade dipped slightly, the way something dips when the grip on it loosens. That was the moment. I moved, 1 step diagonal, left hand high to redirect the blade arm, right hand over the wrist, small circular pressure against the joint. The kind of disarm technique the Appalachian Reclamation Zone taught in basic settler safety, designed for use against bog crawlers and other things larger than you that had you at a disadvantage. It was not designed for a Vektari student with a ceremonial knife. It worked anyway. The knife was in my hand. Pros was sitting on the floor. He had not been thrown. He had not been hurt. He had simply gone down, the way things go down when the thing they were holding onto disappears. He sat on the floor of the lecture hall and he put his face in his hands, and he made a sound that the earpiece took a long moment to translate and then offered. Grief vocalization, sincere, involuntary. He was crying. I stood there with the knife in my hand. I looked at the room. 14 beings staring at me. Svel's skin coming back online in slow, uncertain pulses. Professor Alindri still frozen at the podium. Pell against the back wall with an expression my earpiece did not attempt to translate. I walked to Professor Alindri's desk and set the knife down on the corner of it, handle toward her. I said, someone should probably call the support services line. I went back to my seat. I sat down. I picked up my pen. My hand was shaking. I looked at it. My right hand, the one that had done the disarm, was trembling slightly, a fine, persistent tremor that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the adrenaline your body produces whether you ask it to or not. I looked at it the way you look at something that belongs to you but is behaving independently. I set the pen down. I drew a bog crawler, slowly, carefully. I drew the hunch of the shoulders and the wide-set jaw and all 6 legs, and by the time I finished, my hand had steadied. Campus security arrived 4 minutes later. Pross was taken out quietly. He did not resist. He walked with his head down and his crest still flat, and right before he went through the door, he turned and looked back at the room, at no one in particular, at everyone in general. I do not know what expression was on his face. My earpiece did not translate it. I do not think it had a word. Professor Alindri canceled the remainder of the lecture. Nobody moved for a long time after the door closed. I closed my notebook. Outside the curved windows of the lecture hall, the pale blue dwarf star that Nexus orbited was climbing toward midpoint in its arc, and the light it threw was thin and cold and very far from home. I thought about Pross sitting on the floor with his face in his hands. I thought about my hand trembling over a bog crawler sketch. I thought, well, shoot. Then I picked up my bag and went to find something better than cardboard chicken for lunch. The university counseling office smelled like synthetic lavender and quiet anxiety. The counselor was Thalori. Her name was Velsana. She had a warm amber glow that pulsed slightly when she was choosing her words carefully, and she had a glass bowl of small, smooth stones on her desk that I suspected were supposed to be calming. She had clearly prepared for our session. She had notes. She had a soft, deliberate voice. She had questions arranged in a specific order that I recognized, from tone alone, as a trauma intake structure. She asked me how I was processing the incident. I asked her if there was real coffee in the building. There was not. I told her I was fine. She said that was understandable, that many beings who experienced high-stress situations reported feeling fine immediately afterward as a protective response, and that often the deeper processing came later, in waves, and that I should not be surprised if I found myself. I said I grew up in the Appalachian Reclamation Zone. She paused. Her glow shifted slightly into a color I did not have a word for yet. I said we had 3 bog crawler encounters in a 2-mile radius the year I turned 14. I said a friend's dislocated shoulder in a field when I was 16. I once spent 4 days in a collapsed shelter during a seismic event waiting for extraction. I'm not saying any of that to sound impressive. I am saying it because fine is not a protective response for me. It is just the setting I run at. Velsana looked at her notes. Then she looked at me. She said softly, "That must be a very lonely setting." I did not answer that. I looked at the bowl of smooth stones instead. She let the silence sit, which I respected. Outside her office, the campus had already erupted. I found this out when I left the session and checked my communication device for the first time in 2 hours. There were 47 unread messages. Svel had sent 9 of them. The 9th one just said, "Mara, please look at this," and contained a link. I looked at it. The lecture hall had been recorded. They were all recorded for academic archive purposes. Someone had clipped the relevant 14 seconds. 14 seconds from the moment I stood up to the moment I set the knife on the desk. The clip had been posted to the Interstellar Academic Network by someone in the room. Identity unknown. Title simply, "Human Student, Nexus Academy Today." It had been viewed at that point 400,000 times. I sat down on a bench in the corridor outside Velsana's office and read the comments Svel had collected for me. He had organized them by species origin and emotional register, because Svel was, at his core, a linguist and he could not help himself. From a Thalori account, the human did not run. Why did the human not run? Every threat response in the biological literature says flight or freeze. The human walked toward it. From a Vektari academic, she assessed the situation in under 2 seconds and made a correct tactical judgment about threat level and intent. That is not instinct. That is trained environmental reading. What kind of environment trains that? From an anonymous account, species unspecified, she put the knife down and sat back down and picked up a pen. What is that? What is that? From another anonymous account, the human's heart rate, per biosensor data shared by a fellow student present, did not exceed baseline during the incident. What does Earth do to people? I read them for a while. Then I read the one Svel had flagged with a small note that said, "This is my favorite, Mara. I do not fully understand why." It said, she said, "Well, shoot, after all of that, well, shoot." I laughed, out loud, alone on the bench in the corridor, a short, genuine sound. And Thalori student passing by saw me and walked faster. Svel found me on the bench 20 minutes later. He sat beside me, which he had not done in week 1. He had maintained a careful spatial distance at all times, but that had been eroding gradually since the crate incident, and he had something in his hands. A small wrapped package. He held it out. I looked at it. He said it was from a collective order he had placed with 3 other Thalori students who had also been in the lecture hall, and had, in his words, experienced a strong wish to do something for me, and did not know what humans accepted as meaningful gestures. So they had consulted the Interstellar Student Resource Guide under the heading Human Customs, which had recommended food items of personal cultural significance. I opened the package. It was an actual granola bar. Real grain, real honey, small print on the label that said manufactured in the Tennessee agricultural sector, Earth Sol. It was slightly crushed. I looked at it for a long moment. I said, "Svel, I could cry." He said, "Please don't. I have no framework for that and I will panic." I put the granola bar in my bag for later, somewhere specific, like something I intended to earn. Draven was waiting outside the dormitory. He was not packing, the Keth did not pace. It was considered undignified, but he was standing in a way that indicated he had been there for some time. When I walked up, he straightened slightly, which for a Keth was approximately what standing up from a chair was for a human. He said, "My family has a political interest in what happened today." I said, "Hello to you too." He considered that. He said, "Hello." I said, "What kind of political interest?" He explained, at a length that suggested he had rehearsed it, that the Keth Collective had been in an active internal debate for 6 decades about human integration into collective institutions, that there were 2 major positions. The first held that humans were a destabilizing presence, too unpredictable, too physiologically extreme, too difficult to socially calibrate around. The second held that humans represented a necessary and underutilized resource, and that the collective's resistance to integration was cultural conservatism dressed up as safety concern. He said that what I had done in that lecture hall today had given both sides exactly the material they most wanted. I said I was not thinking about Keth internal politics when I stood up. He said, I know. I said I was thinking that he was crying. Draven was quiet for a moment. His scale plating caught the thin blue dwarf light in a way that was, I noted and immediately set aside, genuinely interesting to look at. He said, that is either very simple or very profound. I have not yet decided which. I said, it's just true, that's all. He looked at me for a long moment, not the calculating look from orientation week, something more direct. He said he would be attending the formal hearing that had been scheduled for the following week, at which I would be asked to testify. I said I had not been officially notified of a hearing. He said I would be by morning. I thanked him for the warning. He said it was not a warning, it was information. I told him those were sometimes the same thing. His jaw shifted slightly. I had started to recognize that as his version of a smile. I went inside. That night I called my mother. The communication lag to Earth-Sol from Nexus was 11 light minutes each way, which meant a conversation was really an exchange of monologues with 22-minute gaps between them. I recorded my message in the small Thalori bright glow of the room while Svel was at a study session, told her about the lecture hall, about the knife, about the clip going around the network. I kept it factual. I did not mention my hand. 22 minutes later her message came back. She said, "You okay, baby?" That was it, 3 words. Not "you're a hero," not "the whole galaxy is watching," not "I'm proud of you" or "be careful" or "what were you thinking." Just "you okay, baby?" I sat in the dark of the room for a long time after that. Svel came back and saw me sitting in the dark, and his glow shifted to the uncertain amber that meant he was trying to decide whether to ask. I told him I was fine. He said, "Is that the setting you run at, or the real kind?" I looked at him. He said, "I listened outside the counselor's office for a moment. I am sorry. I was concerned." I told him it was a fair question. I said it was mostly the setting, but underneath the setting just a little, it was also the real kind. He sat at his desk and turned his glow down low, which I had learned was what he did when he wanted to give me quiet without leaving. I looked at the ceiling. 11 light minutes away, my mother was probably back at work by now, probably not thinking about it anymore. That was home, you noted the thing, you confirmed the person was standing, and then you went back to what needed doing. I thought about Pross again. I had asked about him twice and been redirected both times. He was in the university's wellness center. That was all anyone would confirm. I wrote him a message I wasn't sure I was allowed to send, and then I saved it as a draft, and then I closed the device. My hand was not shaking anymore. I pulled the granola bar out of my bag. I ate half of it. I saved the rest. The formal hearing chamber was on the administrative level of the central tower, and it was designed to impress. The walls were paneled in deep-grain composite that mimicked the ceremonial stone of old Silvari architecture. The ceiling was vaulted, with light arrays calibrated to produce something warm and neutral that would not advantage any particular species' visual range. There were 23 officials from 9 species seated in a curved arrangement, the kind of seating that was designed to feel like a conversation but functioned like a judgment. I was given a chair. It was Vectari proportioned, again. I sat in it sideways with one knee up. One of the officials, a Thalori senior administrator named Rin Vel, looked at my posture and made a small notation on her pad. I did not change the posture. They introduced themselves in order, species by species, title by title. I listened. I have a good memory for names. By the end of the introductions, I had all 23. The first 40 minutes were documentation. What happened when it happened, what I did, in what order. I answered everything directly. A Vectari official named Crestal, senior faculty liaison, older, with a crest that moved almost independently from his expressions like it was thinking its own separate thoughts, asked me to describe, in my own words, the moment I made the decision to approach the student. I said I did not experience it as a decision. It was more like a conclusion. He asked me to explain the difference. I said a decision is when you weigh options. A conclusion is when the information you have only points in one direction. I looked at Pross, and the information only pointed one way. Crestal made a notation. A Silvari official asked me whether I had received any training in threat response or tactical intervention. I said the Appalachian Reclamation Zone offered basic settler safety courses to all residents beginning at age 10. The course covered field medicine, environmental hazard response, and physical intervention techniques for encounters with large fauna. I had completed it at 10, again at 13 for the advanced certificate, and had assisted in teaching the 10-year-old level for 2 summers when I was 15 and 16. There was a pause in the chamber. The Silvari official said, with careful neutrality, "You began training in physical intervention at age 10. I said most kids from my area did. Another pause. A Cuth official, older than Druven, with the same iridescent scale plating but heavier, more formal, said that in the collective's cultural framework, the act of moving toward a declared threat in a communal space was categorized as either a dominance display or a territorial aggression, and asked which category applied. I looked at him. I said neither. He asked me to explain. I said he was not a declared threat. He was a student in a crisis with a ceremonial object he did not know how to put down. I walked toward him because, standing at the back of the room and waiting for him to make a choice he would not be able to take back seemed like the worst outcome. The Cuth official said, "You assessed his intent as non-aggressive." I said yes. He said in under 2 seconds. I said it took about 1.5. The chamber was very quiet. Run Vull, the Thalari administrator, leaned forward. She said, "How?" I thought about how to answer that. I said his wrist was loose. The blade was pointed out but not up. The angle was wrong for active intent. His crest was flat against his skull. Flat means shame and exhaustion in Vuktari display language. I checked that in the prep material. He was looking at the room like he was waiting for something to happen to him, not planning something. And he was shaking, not the focus kind of shaking, the falling apart kind. I paused. I said, where I grew up you read things. Terrain, weather, animals. You read them fast and you read them accurately because being wrong has a cost. I read him the same way. Run Vull sat back. The chamber sat with that for a moment. Then Druven spoke. He was seated at the far end of the official's curve, the only Cuth present who had not yet asked a question. He spoke at a measured pace, which I had come to recognize as how he spoke when he had thought carefully about every word in advance. He said that the Cuth collective's ongoing debate about human integration had, for 6 decades, centered on the wrong question. The debate had asked whether humans were safe, whether they could be trusted in shared spaces, whether their physiological differences created unacceptable social friction, whether their responses to stress were too unpredictable for collective environments. He said that the incident in the lecture hall did not settle that question because it was never the right question. He said the right question was whether the collective had taken any serious effort to understand what humans actually were, not as a threat category, not as a novelty, but as a functional intelligence shaped by an environment unlike anything the collective had produced. He said that Muravus had walked toward a crisis that 14 multi-species individuals had responded to with pure distress response, had assessed it correctly in under 2 seconds, had resolved it in 4, and had then sat back down and continued her day. He said this was not recklessness. He said this was not aggression. He said this was the operational output of a nervous system built by a planet that spent 100,000 years selecting for exactly that kind of function. He said the collective kept asking whether it was safe to let humans in. He said the better question was what was lost by keeping them out. The chamber was still. I looked at Druven. He was looking at the panel, not at me, making an argument. That was what he had said he was doing when he told me he would be here making an argument. He had not told me it would be that argument. I looked back at the panel. Run Vol said quietly, "Ms. Vuss, do you have anything to add to what the Cuth representative has said?" I thought about it for a real moment, not a polite pause, an actual one. Then I said, "I want to say one thing about the student, about Pruss." The chamber shifted slightly, attention refocusing. I said, "I have asked twice this week about his condition and been redirected. I understand there are privacy protocols. I'm not asking for details. I am asking that someone in this room confirm that he has access to support. That someone is actually checking on him. Because the thing that brought him to that room, whatever it was, that is still in him somewhere. And I am less interested in what he did with that than in whether anyone is helping him carry it." Nobody spoke. I said, "He sat on the floor and cried. That is not a person who wants to hurt anyone. That is a person who has been running out of road for a long time. I would like to know someone is paying attention to that." Runvel looked at me for a long moment. She said, "He has a full support team assigned. He is being cared for." I said, "Good. That is the most important thing that happened in that room." The hearing continued for another hour. At the end, they excused me to a side corridor while they deliberated. Druven came out shortly after because the Cuth representative was not voting staff, only advisory. He stood in the corridor with me. I said, "That argument you made, you thought about that for a while." He said, "Since orientation week." I said, "That first night, in the Commons." He said, "You caught a crate one-handed and kept talking about a map." I said, "It was a bad map." He looked at me, and that stillness came to his eyes. The one I had catalogued as his version of something warmer than neutrality. He said, "My family is going to say you are a disruption." I said, "Am I?" He said, "Yes, but the collective has been very comfortable for a very long time. Comfortable is not the same as correct." Before I could answer, the chamber door opened and Runvel appeared and told me the panel had reached its conclusion. I was cleared, commended in the formal language of the decision for de-escalation of a high-risk situation with minimal harm outcome. Druven walked back to the main corridor with me. He said his family still wanted to meet me. I said I had heard that was not going to go well for them. He said for them no, for the conversation yes. I thought about that. I thought about 23 officials from 9 species sitting in a room trying to figure out what to do with a girl from the Appalachian Reclamation Zone who caught things that fell and walked toward things that were hurting. I thought, well, Lord have mercy, this is going to be a long degree. The East Dormitory roof was not technically accessible to students. There was a door at the top of the maintenance stairwell that was labeled restricted access and sealed with a keypad. The keypad had been installed 12 years ago by a facilities team that had not, at any point in the last 12 years, changed the default code. Sval had discovered this in his first week because Sval was a person who tested default codes on locked doors, the way other people tested whether a chair was stable before sitting in it, quietly, methodically, and without making a production of it. He had shown me the roof on the 5th day of orientation. He had said, with his characteristic precision, that it was the only location on the Nexus station from which you could observe 4 of the station's orbital rings simultaneously if the atmospheric filters were in their cycling phase, which occurred between the 19th and 22nd hour of the station clock. He had said this in a tone that suggested he was sharing a fact. I had understood it as an invitation. I went up there the night of the hearing. It was the 21st hour. The filters were cycling. The 4 rings were visible, great arcs of pale silver against the star-scattered dark, each one carrying the lights of transport traffic and infrastructure systems that I knew, intellectually, represented the logistical backbone of 7 inhabited systems, but which looked from here like someone had drawn careful curved lines across the sky with a very steady hand. The star was low on the horizon. The pale blue dwarf that Nexus orbited had no name in Standard, only a catalog designation, but I had started calling it pale in my head because it was the palest light I had ever lived under, and I had grown up under the filtered winter light of Appalachian Ridge country, which was not known for being warm. I sat on the edge of a ventilation housing and ate the second half of the granola bar. Real grain, real honey. The Tennessee agricultural sector had been reclaimed from industrial wasteland over 40 years by people who had decided that the ground was worth saving and then done the work to save it. The granola bar tasted like that decision, like effort and stubborn patience and the particular sweetness of things that had been earned. It tasted like home. Not the easy version of home. Not the version people imagine when they said they missed a place, soft-lit and simplified, all the difficult parts smoothed out by distance. The real version. The version that was cold in winter and hard in summer, and asked more of you than you sometimes had to give and kept asking anyway, and somehow, in the asking, made you into someone who could catch a falling crate and not flinch, and walk toward a crying student in a room full of beings who were all running the other way. I sat with that for a while. The hearing outcome had been sent to my communication device with formal language and 3 separate acknowledgement requirements. I had acknowledged all 3 on the walk back from the administrative tower. I had also, in the same walk, received 42 new messages, follow-up from the network clip, which had now reached numbers I found mildly surreal, requests for comment from 2 academic publications and 1 news service, and a message from the university's student affairs office asking if I would be willing to speak at an upcoming orientation event for incoming first-year students. I had not replied to any of them. I had also received 1 message that was not from any institution or publication or news service. It was from Pros. It was short. I had expected, if he ever contacted me, something long, an explanation, an apology built from layers of justification, the kind of message people write when they have had a lot of time and too much silence. It was not that. It was 4 sentences. He said he did not have the words in Standard or in his native Vectari register for what he wanted to say. He said he had been told by his support team that I had asked about him at the hearing. He said he did not know why that mattered as much as it did. He said thank you. I read it twice. Then I wrote back. 2 sentences. I told him I was glad he was being looked after. I told him the only thing I wanted from him was to still be here next semester. I sent it before I could think about whether I was allowed to. Behind me, the roof access door opened. I did not turn around immediately. The footsteps were a specific rhythm, a little longer in stride than Svel, heavier in placement, deliberate. I knew them already, which surprised me slightly when I registered it. Draven walked to the edge of the roof and stood a few feet to my left, looking at the same 4 rings and the same pale star. He said, "Svel told me you were up here." I said, "Svel told you?" He said, I asked. He considered for a moment and then said yes and explained the default code. I said, he is going to be a liability someday. Draven said, he is going to be exceptional someday. A pause. He already is. I looked at the rings. He said after a moment, my family received the hearing outcome. I said, how did they take it? He said, my father used 14 words I will not translate directly, several of which were specific to the Keth formal register for displeasure with an institutional outcome. My mother asked 3 questions about you that I was unable to fully answer. I said, what questions? He said the first was where I was from, specifically, because the pre-enrollment record said Earth-Sol Appalachian, but the collective's geographic records for Earth were general and she wanted detail. The second was what I was studying and what I intended to do with it. The third, And he paused here, for the first time in our entire acquaintance, with something that looked like care, was what kind of person I was when nothing was happening. I said, what kind of person I am when nothing is happening. He said, yes. I thought about that. I said, I draw bog crawlers. I drink whatever is available and call it coffee even when it isn't. I ask about people when I should probably let it go. I learn the names of things I intend to stay near. I paused. I eat granola bars on rooftops. He said, you learn the names of things you intend to stay near. I said, I know 4 of Nexus's orbital rings by their catalog designations. I know the name of the pale blue dwarf. I know what amber means in Thalori skinlight and what flat crest means in Vectari display language, and what jaw stillness means in Keth expression register. He was quiet for a moment. He said, that last one. I said, I know. The wind, or what passed for wind in the station's atmospheric system, a slow circulation that was engineered to feel like air rather than machinery, moved between us without deciding anything. He said, my family's position will be that you represent a category problem, that humans specifically, and you specifically, are too difficult to predict, too physiologically distinct, too socially unclassifiable for the kind of careful relationship my family's political standing requires. I said, and your position. He said, without hesitation, that they have been comfortable for a very long time. I looked at him. He was looking at the rings. The pale light caught the line of his jaw and the edge of the scale plating along his neck, and he looked, I thought, the way something looks when it has made a decision and is waiting for the moment to name it. I said, I should tell you something. He looked at me. I said, my hand shook. In the lecture hall when I sat back down, my hand was shaking, not from fear, from the adrenaline your body produces whether you ask it to or not. I drew bog crawlers until it stopped. He said nothing. I said, I tell you that because I think you should know that I am not what the clip makes me look like. I am not unmoved. I am just moved on a delay, and by the time the moving happens I have usually found something to do with my hands. He said, why are you telling me this? I said, because you made an argument for me today in front of 23 officials from 9 species, and it was a good argument, and I think you should know who you were making it for. The station's atmospheric system sighed its engineered sigh around us. Draven said, a person who draws bog crawlers until her hand stops shaking. I said, yes. He said, a person who asks about the student that everyone else has already stopped thinking about. I said, yes. He said, a person who learns the names of things she intends to stay near. I did not answer that. He turned back to the rings. We stood in the pale blue light for a while, without saying anything else. I have thought since then about the question the Thalori official asked me in the hearing. The old one, the one who had been doing her job long enough that she asked things carefully, without decoration. She had asked, does it frighten you, what you are? I had answered. I had said something honest and a little raw, and I had let the silence hold it. But I had also, since then, found a longer answer. The kind you don't say out loud in a formal chamber because it takes more room than that. The longer answer was this. There was a version of my life where what I am was only a weight, where being the thing that doesn't run, the thing that doesn't freeze, the thing built for a planet most species would not survive, was only loneliness and distance, and the permanent exhaustion of existing somewhere you were never quite expected. I had lived parts of that version. I knew its texture. But there was another version running underneath it, the way a second current runs under the surface of moving water. In that version, the thing I was had walked toward a student no one else was walking toward, and he was alive. In that version, a Thalori roommate who had researched me like a threat and stood near the door on day 1, was now giving me the specific location of unlocked rooftops and sending me 9 messages when he was worried. In that version, a Keth representative from a politically careful family was standing next to me on that unlocked rooftop at the 21st hour, saying things slowly and precisely, the way you say things when every word counts. In that version, being built the way I was built was not the reason I was alone. It was the reason I was here. I pulled my notebook out of my jacket pocket. I had started carrying it with me after the incident, a habit I had not decided on but had apparently adopted. I opened it to a fresh page. I drew a bog crawler, small, careful, the hunch of the shoulders and the wide-set jaw, all 6 legs. Draven glanced down at the drawing. He said, "What is that?" I said, "Bog crawler, native fauna from my region of Earth. 6 legs, ambush hunter, territorial. They can take a limb if you're not paying attention." He said, "And you find them calming to draw." I said, "My whole childhood was paying attention to them. Drawing them means I already made it through." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Show me the real one sometime, in reference material." I looked at him. He said, "I would like to understand what you grew up paying attention to." I closed the notebook. The 4 rings moved in their slow arcs above us, carrying their lights and their freight and their years of careful galactic infrastructure, everything the collective had built in the centuries it had been comfortable. I thought, I am going to be very bad at comfortable. I thought, that is probably fine. I thought, I have a class at 8 in the morning and a communication lag to account for if I want to tell my mother how the hearing went and a draft message to Pross that I already sent and cannot take back, and a Thalori roommate who will leave his glow on low all night if I am not back before he falls asleep. I thought, I have a granola bar wrapper in my pocket and a notebook full of bog crawlers and a degree to finish, and 11 light minutes of distance between me and the woman who raised me to be the boring one. I thought, well, I guess I am staying. Draven said, "You should sleep." I said, "Probably." He said, "I will walk back with you." I said, "You do not have to." He said, "I know." We went down through the maintenance stairwell, past the keypad with its 12-year-old default code, back into the lit corridors of Nexus Academy, where 47 species were sleeping or studying or worrying about their own versions of the things that kept beings awake at the 21st hour. My dormitory was on the east side, 11 floors down. Draven walked with me to the door. He said, "My mother's 3rd question." I said, "The one you could not answer." He said, "I can answer it now." I waited. He said, "She asked what kind of person you are when nothing is happening. I told her I would find out." I said, "And?" He said, "You are exactly the same. That is very unusual." He walked back toward the Keth residential section, without waiting for me to respond. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Svel was awake. I could see the warm amber glow under the door before I opened it, that steady, settled light that meant he was still up, probably reading, keeping his glow low so as not to disturb anyone, in the specific way he had developed over 5 weeks of living with a human who kept different hours and came home from rooftops at the 21st hour. I opened the door. He looked up from his desk. He said nothing. His glow stayed amber. I took my boots off. I sat on the edge of my bed. Outside, the pale blue dwarf was still making its slow arc, throwing its thin, cold light across everything it reached. I said, "Hey, Svel." He said, "Yes." I said, "I think I am going to be all right here." His glow shifted, just slightly at the edges, to something warmer, something I did not have a precise translation for yet, though I was learning. He said, "I know, I have read the literature." I said, "The literature does not know everything." He said, "No, but I have also met you." I lay back on the bed. I looked at the ceiling. 11 light minutes away, my mother was probably asleep, probably not worried because she had raised me to be the boring one and the boring ones came back. That was the deal. That had always been the deal. I closed my eyes. I thought about Pross and hoped he was sleeping too. I thought about Draven, walking down a corridor, saying things slowly and precisely to someone he had decided was worth being precise with. I thought about my hand, which had not shaken since the rooftop. I thought about bog crawlers. I thought 11 light minutes is not that far. I thought 4 seconds is a very short time. I thought I am the boring one and the boring ones stay, and staying is the whole point, and I am going to stay. Svel turned his glow down to the barest thread of amber light. I slept.